What if Israel's fastest military operation yet becomes its most dangerous gamble? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists that the new offensive in Gaza will be over fairly quickly. He claims this is the only way to defeat Hamas and free the remaining hostages. But as bombs pound Gaza City with unprecedented intensity, the world holds its breath. Will this really end the war, or unleash a disaster? International warnings are growing louder. Italy's foreign minister warns the invasion of Gaza risks turning into a Vietnam for Israeli soldiers, suggesting a drawn-out conflict that could drain Israel's strength and morale. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom, France, and Denmark have joined in a rare joint United Nations statement. Expanding military operations will only endanger the lives of all civilians in Gaza, including the remaining hostages, and result in further unnecessary suffering. The stakes could not be higher. With more than 61,000 Palestinians already killed and starvation spreading, a rapid escalation could lead to humanitarian collapse on an unimaginable scale. Israel's own military officials have cautioned that deeper involvement might backfire, trapping their forces in endless guerrilla warfare and shattering whatever remains of the country's international standing. If Netanyahu is wrong, Israel could face a nightmare, a protracted war, civilian catastrophe, and permanent damage to its moral and diplomatic reputation. Even allies are now questioning whether this operation will end the bloodshed or plunge the region into chaos. So how did Israel reach this precarious point? And why are so many voices, both inside and outside the country, warning of disaster? Let's break down the events and decisions that brought us here. Why now? And why does Prime Minister Netanyahu call this blitz the only option? The roots of Israel's latest military offensive stretch back to early October of 2023, when Hamas-led militants stormed into Israel, killing over 1,200 people and seizing 251 hostages. Since then, the war has raged with relentless intensity, and Israeli authorities now say that of about 50 hostages still held in Gaza, only 20 are believed to be alive. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists he has no choice but to complete the job and defeat Hamas to free hostages seized from Israel. After a security cabinet meeting approved a plan to seize control of Gaza City despite widespread criticism at home and abroad, Netanyahu claims the new offensive is the only path left. He promises it will be fairly quick, telling the world that Israel must finish the job, even as the United Nations Security Council hears urgent pleas to end Palestinian suffering. But on the ground, reality is grim. Palestinians are enduring the heaviest bombing in weeks, just hours after Netanyahu's vow. Gaza City, once home to 1 million people, now faces waves of bombardment, while desperately hungry civilians scramble for dwindling aid. International agencies warn famine is unfolding, with over 100 children among more than 200 deaths from starvation and malnutrition so far. Aid deliveries are sporadic and often dangerous. A 14-year-old boy recently died after an airdropped food box landed on his tent. Netanyahu claims the offensive will end quickly and does not intend to occupy Gaza, saying, "We want a security belt right next to our border, but we do not want to stay in Gaza." Yet critics, including some Israeli officials and European leaders, argue the opposite, that expanding the military campaign could risk the lives of the remaining hostages, deepen humanitarian disaster, and drag Israel into a protracted conflict. Italy's foreign minister has even warned that an invasion could become Israel's Vietnam. The stakes are immense. Beyond the military goals, this operation could shatter thousands of civilian lives, test the credibility of international law, and reshape how the world responds to crises. As Israel faces mounting global outrage, the question remains, is this assault truly necessary or dangerously reckless? But is this really the only option? Around the world, critics and even voices within Israel are raising alarms about where this road could lead. Next, we'll break down the key arguments from critics, including Israeli officials and international leaders, who warn that this offensive may do far more harm than Netanyahu is willing to admit. What if the very offensive meant to end Gaza's crisis is actually making it worse? Blink and you could miss the moment everything shifts, from hope for relief to a new wave of catastrophe. Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists the accelerated Gaza campaign will over fairly quickly, but the world watches in alarm as devastation escalates. The stakes could not be higher. International aid groups warn malnutrition is now rampant among Gaza's nearly 2 million residents. In just the last 24 hours, 5 more people, including 2 children, have died from starvation. If the crisis deepens, countless more could follow. Even aid meant to help is proving deadly. In a tragic twist, 23 Palestinians have been killed so far by airdropped crates, including a 14-year-old boy struck while waiting desperately for food. The risk is multiplying. As Israel plans to expand operations, the United Nations and leading European governments have sounded the alarm, declaring expanding military operations will only endanger the lives of all civilians in Gaza, including the remaining hostages, and bring further avoidable suffering. Netanyahu's promise of a rapid conclusion faces skepticism from allies and critics alike. Israel's own military chief warns that full-scale occupation could trap Israeli troops in a drawn-out, deadly guerrilla campaign and endanger the remaining hostages. Italy's foreign minister has even likened the looming operation to Vietnam for Israeli soldiers, underlining the grave risks of escalation. Inside Gaza, Palestinians report the heaviest bombardments in weeks, while so-called safe zones fail to shield civilians from harm. The Israeli government asserts that Hamas is to blame for the mounting humanitarian disaster, but international observers and aid agencies point to deliberate restrictions on food and medical supplies. Israel continues to deny these claims, stating that it has already distributed significant aid. What hangs in the balance is the legitimacy of Israel's actions, the survival of Gaza's civilian population, and the fate of the remaining hostages. With each new escalation, the risk grows, international outrage intensifies, regional stability teeters, and the very campaign promising security could instead sow the seeds of generational suffering for both peoples. So, how did a mission to save lives become a flashpoint for global condemnation? The answer lies in a cascade of decisions and their consequences that the world is now forced to confront. But what if quick victory is just a mirage, hiding the gateway to another endless war? Before we look away, ask, how many lives, reputations, and global alliances are on the line if this gamble fails? Blink, and what's at stake could slip beyond recovery. Prime Minister Netanyahu vows the new Gaza offensive will end swiftly, but history screams otherwise. Urban warfare almost never follows a script. The real risk? The promise of speed may cost thousands of lives and drag the world into a crisis with no clear exit. Even Israel's own military chief cautions that pushing deeper could doom the hostages and mire Israeli troops in bloody, grinding street battles. Italy's foreign minister amplifies that warning, insisting Israel listen to its generals. Comparisons to America's Vietnam echo as a warning. Overwhelming force can still be swallowed by resistance and tragedy. Across the globe, the alarm bells are deafening. United Nations leaders demand an end to Palestinian suffering, while the UK, France, and Denmark declare this is a man-made disaster. Urgent action is critical to stop starvation and rush aid into Gaza. Still, the border remains nearly sealed, bombardment continues, and aid is choked off. Each day brings more deaths, more families uprooted, and rising reports of starvation. If this offensive drags on, the dangers multiply. Civilians find themselves trapped between bombs and famine with nowhere safe to turn. Hostages, whose release was the operation's stated goal, risk vanishing in the fog of war. Israeli soldiers are left to fight for weeks or even months, their morale battered as international outrage grows. There are deeper stakes. An endless war in Gaza threatens to unravel regional stability, deepen divides between allies, and shake the foundations of international law. The diplomatic fallout could leave Israel increasingly isolated and harden global divides on humanitarian intervention. So, when leaders talk of finishing the job, what price is truly being paid? The answer may shape not just Gaza's future, but the security, values, and standing of nations around the world. But how did we get to this boiling point? And what choices remain for the people caught in the crossfire? Let's break down what's at stake for every side. Is there a path out of this spiral that doesn't repeat the same mistakes? At this crossroads, practical action is not only possible, it is essential. International outrage has reached a fever pitch, but words alone have not stemmed the suffering or halted the cycle. European representatives at the United Nations have warned that famine is unfolding in Gaza and that Israel's current military plan would only make things worse. Humanitarian agencies and Gaza's own media office have called for an end to inhumane methods like aid airdrops, which have killed civilians. As the media office stated, "We have repeatedly warned of the dangers of these inhumane methods and have consistently called for the safe and sufficient delivery of aid through land crossings." Yet, even as starvation deaths mount, over 200 have died from malnutrition and hunger, including more than 100 children. Meaningful policy shifts lag behind the urgency on the ground. Some Israeli officials themselves warn against full occupation, fearing endless guerrilla conflict and a quagmire that could become Israel's Vietnam. The risks of escalation and further civilian casualties are clear, but so too are the opportunities for international actors and ordinary citizens to demand new priorities from their governments and the media. What could be done differently? Governments must place real pressure on all sides to guarantee safe, large-scale aid delivered by land, not just airdrops that risk more deaths. Citizens can demand transparency and accountability, push lawmakers to support immediate ceasefire negotiations, insist on independent reporting from the ground, and challenge narratives that dehumanize or oversimplify the crisis. Media organizations, for their part, must avoid repeating official talking points and instead center the lived realities of civilians trapped in conflict zones. And crucially, the United States and its allies must match their stated commitments to humanitarian needs with concrete, measurable steps, ensuring that emergency aid reaches those in need and that diplomatic efforts prioritize peace over military expedience. Ultimately, the responsibility isn't just on leaders. Here's what matters next. But what does all this mean for the people most affected? And what will the consequences be if the world fails to act? Let's look at what could unfold if this moment is ignored. History will not just judge decisions, but also the silence that lets injustice grow. Ignore this moment, and we risk losing more than headlines. Right now, every voice is a line between conscience and complicity. As Israel launches its latest offensive in Gaza, with Prime Minister Netanyahu promising it will end fairly quickly, the world has instead seen escalating violence and deepening suffering. The United Nations and leaders worldwide have condemned the operation, warning of a looming man-made catastrophe and the real threat of an endless disaster. More than 61,000 Palestinians have been killed since the war began. Starvation and disease run rampant. Aid convoys barely reach those in need, while warnings from both Israeli officials and global observers grow sharper. A drawn-out ground campaign risks becoming Israel's Vietnam, trapping soldiers and civilians in a nightmare with no clear exit. Staying silent or blindly accepting official narratives risks enabling further tragedy. It chips away at the laws and principles designed to safeguard civilians and uphold our shared humanity. The credibility of international law, the moral authority of governments, and the lives of thousands hang in the balance. We cannot afford to look away. Demand accountability. Ask the hard questions. Insist that leaders, regardless of their flag, answer for their choices and their consequences. Because what unfolds in Gaza will echo long after the last bomb falls, redefining not just headlines, but the very standards of compassion and justice that shape who we are. In the end, the world's response will set a precedent for future crises. The stakes could not be higher.